it's obviously for the wicked. Like God doesn't see, like He doesn't have pleasure in the death of the wicked. Yeah. So we always obviously need to home in on also is the fact that the reason why obviously they'll be put to death or like the reason why they'll be put to death is so that it doesn't contaminate, because sin contaminates.
Right.
Once sin
Yeah.
is done
Yeah.
and it's finished, it then spreads. And people like to do that. Once people see something that's bad, like for instance when we say don't do that, like, oh, when you tell someone, like a child, not to do that, they want to do it. And when you tell them that they don't want to do it, then they'll go and tell their friends, I done this, and then their friends want to experience. You know what I'm saying?
Exactly. That's a very good analogy. Yeah. So then, in order not to have a society like that in God's, because remember, this is a kingdom under God. So God said, in my kingdom, we're going to be an example to the world. And we're not going to be messing about. We're going to have a holy priest, a nation of priests. Was God's plan. So we're going to be a serious people. And so that was why they had those certain things. Now, also, this is another point I want to bring out, is this. Most people have this idea that, well, who was God? Who does he think he was to do this and do that and all these things and give those type of commands? And one thing you need to understand is that in the Old Testament, the Father is not, like, he's not really, like the Bible says we read earlier in John 1:18, no man has seen God at any time. So the Father was rarely ever around, because his presence is so powerful it would destroy man. In his mercy, the Bible says God hides his face in Isaiah 59. So Jesus said, when you search the scriptures, John 5:39, they testify of me. So most of the occurrences you see of God in the Old Testament relating to man, if the Father came and related to man, man would be dead. So the person that was in all those direct relations to man was Christ. Christ is the one that he comes to God's creatures, and in a sense he mingles with them as if he's one of them, or he reduces his glory so that we can be able to take it. So all those occurrences that you see in the Old Testament where God gave those type of orders that we think, oh, that was so harsh, how that person was the same Jesus that went on the cross and died for every single human being that has ever lived and will ever live. So when you can go and die for your enemy, then you can question his authority and his judgments. But until you can die for the person that hates you, that did evil to your family, until you can say, you know what, Father, forgive them, they don't know what they did, you can't question Christ. So that was the point I wanted to bring. That same Jesus was the same Jesus that gave all those orders that we say they're so unfair and so on in the Old Testament. I'll bring this one as well. When you study the work of ancient Israel, one of the main things they did was they went to war. They would go to war against these other nations, and they would take over their territory. Pretty much like under David, was with the campaigns of David was the most successful period of the nation of Israel. And all David did was, he was a man of war. He went to war. And what people need to understand is the reason why they had to do that is because it's only in recent times that we have the concept of a composite society. And what a composite society is a society where you have church and state separate. So, and the first proper composite society was actually, the prototype of it was done in Rhode Island. A man by the name of Roger Williams. It was an English Puritan that had traveled over to the States to start a new life and so on. And while he was there as a Puritan, he came across the Baptists. Now the Baptists, they believe in having free will and baptism by immersion when you're of a grown age. They don't believe in having an established church. And so Roger Williams came across the Baptists. He got converted by the Baptists. And once he was converted by the Baptists, he got persecuted by the Puritans, because now he was believing differently. So he was the one that basically pushed for the idea of having a state in United States where there was no established church. Now, in the early times, people don't know this, but in the United States, when they were just starting up, you had places like Maryland. Maryland was a Catholic colony, and the established church in Maryland was the Catholic Church. So if you were, Maryland, is a Catholic church. Virginia was Anglican. So if you were an Anglican and you lived in Virginia, they would persecute you. If you were a Catholic and you lived in Maryland, you got persecuted. If you were in a Quaker and you lived in Pennsylvania, they would persecute you as well. And so you had all these different established churches, areas with established churches. So Roger Williams, he clocked and he said, you know, what if we can establish a place where people could just worship according to what they believed. However, whether they believed or not, they would be accepted. So that place was Rhode Island. And so Rhode Island, he set up a composite society where the church and state were totally separate. There was no established church supported by the state, and therefore there was no persecution. So people could come, and people said that would be crazy, that wouldn't work. The other thing as well was a lot of corruption happened in the states, because many politicians knew that nobody would vote for them unless they were part of, say, if you imagine you were in Maryland, if you wanted to be an influential politician, you had to join the Catholic Church, which was the established church. So there were people that they didn't believe in religion, they just, for the sake of power, they joined the church, and obviously when they go into power, they did things contrary. So anyway, he established Rhode Island, and Rhode Island was that first composite society and prototype, and it worked to the surprise of people. So then when the time came, they decided to use that prototype idea of Rhode Island, and they used it for the entire United States. And that's why, to a large degree, United States is a country where you have separation of church and state. It's the first proper country where that was done, and obviously many other places want to follow the same. So the reason we looked at that is because in the Old Testament, you didn't have every country or nation that you see in the Old Testament. They all had what we would call a sacral society, or sacerdocical. That's where we get the word sacred. So they had a society where you had the religion and the church and the state power joined together. And what that did was, imagine you were a Moabite. If you didn't, or let's say Philistines. The Philistines, they worshipped Dagon. If you were in Philistia and you chose that you didn't want to worship Dagon anymore, then they would persecute you. Now imagine you had, there were places where part of their worship was offering, okay, I'll give you this example. Part of their worship was, this was more recent, the Aztecs, right? And when I studied about the Aztec people themselves, actually, they work with the Spanish Cortez and some of his comrades. They work with their basically enemies to overthrow their own kingdom. And then I wondered, what kind of people would work against their own kingdom to overthrow it, work with their enemies? And the reason was because imagine if you were an Aztec, they offered like human sacrifices just like that every other hour or every 3 times a day, something like that. And how the sacrifices work, they believe that you give your best to the gods. So they look for the most good-looking people among their people. If you're a really good-looking guy, a really good-looking girl, you are going to be the next sacrifice. So yeah, that's how they live. And they would just offer human sacrifices, and there was this main sacrifice where they pulled out a person's heart while they were alive, and they would offer it to their god. So the people themselves were sick of their religion and their society, and that was why they welcomed the help from outside to overthrow it. So imagine in the Old Testament, there were many of these places where they had these sick religions where they offered child sacrifices, all these type of things. The people were sick of it, but they couldn't do anything about it. Now Israel, the God of Israel, the way he was going to reach those people was he had to overthrow the government, because once the government was overthrown, then the people would have the freedom if they chose to, which was what Israel did. They gave the people the option. If you want to worship how you worship, you can continue doing that. Or if you want to worship our God, which is a good God and his ways are love and so on, then you had the option to have the freedom to do so. And this was why Ruth, when you study in the book of Ruth in the Bible, when Naomi was going back to Israel after her sojourn in Moab, when the husband of Ruth had died, her son, Ruth said, listen, if you go, I can't stay here because I want to go with you. I want to worship your God. I want to live with your people. Because Ruth understood if she had stayed in Moab, she would not have had the religious freedom to worship the God of heaven. So this was the whole idea of why they had wars and so on. And the last thing I want to touch on regarding that is to do with the Amalekites. There's a passage in the book of Samuel where God basically gave an order to Samuel to give to Saul, and Saul was meant to go to the Amalekites the time, God had given them time to change. They hadn't changed. And God told him to wipe everybody in Amalek. Everything, every living thing was to be wiped out. And Saul didn't follow that order strictly. Now, when you study in the Bible, because the Bible works with principles, and there's a principle where about the Amorites in the book of Genesis, God told Moses, I'll give them time because their cup is not yet full. So God gave them loads of time for them to change, and they didn't change. And also there's a principle where if there's one righteous person, God would go in to get, and he'll go in to get them. And you see that with the case of Rahab in Jericho, and also in the case of Lot in Sodom. God made sure that if there was righteous people, he would go in to get them. He wasn't going to just wipe that place out. Also, when you read the story about Sodom and Gomorrah, it wasn't just God just left when Jesus, and it was actually that destruction was done by Jesus when you study it. And Jesus didn't just go to destroy Sodom, where it says that the cry of the people had gone to heaven. The people were sick of the way that they were living, and of the horrors that men were doing to them, to each other. And that their cries went high to heaven, and God said, you know what, I cannot take this anymore. And God said, I have to end this. So it was something like the people were crying to God to end that situation. So those are the principles there, that if those cries have gone heavily to heaven, and God sees that, you know what, there's no other way, he says, I'm going to end it. And so, you know what, this world, one day, the same thing is going to happen here. God is going to end this thing. It's not going to carry on living in this hellhole that we live in. We look at the news and the things that people are doing, people that we say that they've evolved and they're civil, and you read the sick things that happen, and things we don't even know about, we can't even imagine happen. God sees all these things, and the cries of men and the pain that people are going through is going up to heaven, and one day God is going to end even this. But yeah, so that's the point, that God is not going to do so if there's righteous people. He's going to save them. And so the story of the Amalekites is very important, because it's like God knew that people are going to read this story and say, what kind of Jesus knew, because Jesus gave that order, that people are going to read this and say, what kind of cruel God would give this type of order. And so what he did was he saw in his disobedience, he spared the king of the Amalekites. He was a man by the name of Agag. And Agag, Saul spared him because that was a custom. You keep the king and you show him also as his trophy. You keep him as a prisoner. He was trying to be popular. So in him sparing Agag somehow had worked to save some members of his family, which is what anybody would do in a situation like that, where their kingdom has been taken over. They'll try to save at least their children or their family, which I believe Agag must have done. So Samuel comes and says, why have you haven't done God's will? You spared the king Agag. God told you to kill everything. And Samuel ended up slaying Agag. So the point is this, that God put that as a test, because he knew that people would say he's unfair. How could you slay these people? Blah, blah, blah. And so God allowed one person to live, Agag, for a while, and he allowed his family to escape. And from the family of Agag escaping, the Bible tells you that a descendant of Agag rose up in the book of Esther. He was a man by the name of Naaman. And Naaman rose up here. When you read in Esther, Naaman was an Agagite, which means he was a direct descendant of the king Agag of Amalek. He was an Amalekite. And Agag rose up under the Medo-Persian government while the Jews were in captivity in Medo-Persia. That one man rose up, and he was going to destroy every Jew, every Israelite that was around. And the lesson there is that there was a reason why God said those people are so wicked, they had to be put out. Because he said, you know what, I'll let one live. And that one that lived came back and was willing to destroy the whole nation of Israel. And that's why when God gives those type of orders, you'll see that, he's fair. He's fair, and he knows what he's doing. And at the end of the day, it's just a thing of the world has been misguided because there's all these lies about the character of God. And one day, once the skills, say that again.
No, like you're saying, like the character of God.
Yeah.
And it's people make it out like as if the character and the law of God is separate.
Yeah.
But his testimony is the character.
It's his character. Yeah.
His testimony is the law.
Yeah. And most people don't realize the beef that they have with the God in the Old Testament that was Jesus. And whatever beef you have with him, look at the cross and take your beef to him on the cross. And what can you say when Jesus went on the cross and he died for every human being. The same Jesus that you said he did this and that in the Old Testament, he's the same Jesus that went on the cross. So at the end of the day, you know, Jesus came to show us the character of God, because we've been deceived by Satan. And the greatest deception of the devil is showing the world that he doesn't